I don't like anything here at all, said Frodo. Step or stone, breath or bone. Earth, air, and water all seem accursed. But so our path is laid. Yes, that's so, said Sam. And we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo. Adventures, as I used to call them. I used to think they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for. Because they wanted them. Because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of sport, you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have been just landed in them, usually. Their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances like us of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know, because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you. At least not to what folk inside a story, and not outside it, call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same, like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of a tale we've fallen into. Welcome. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is the Forge of Tolkien. Why a forge? Well, a forge is a place for making things out of fire and metal, out of skill and imagination, practical things like horseshoes and wheel rims, dangerous things like swords, but also sometimes beautiful things like jewelry, ornamental gates. Things that take great skill and patience and craft and training and diligence to make, things that you need great materials for, but also great vision and great stamina and great strength to be able to make. Think about the way in which we say you forge ahead in an adventure. It takes courage and discipline and joy. Tolkien, who is our great storyteller, was many things: a lover of language, a father, a signal officer in the Great War, a professor of Anglo-Saxon, an amateur artist, a translator, but above all, of course, he was a wordsmith. In this series, we're going to be, as it were, delving into Tolkien's word hoard, the great treasure, the pile of treasure that he made, that any dragon would want to be able to accumulate and perhaps brood over. Are we going to steal a precious goblet and take it home and make it ours? Or are we going to want to take control of this great word hoard and somehow craft with it ourselves? Are we going to appreciate it and turn the treasures over one at a time, looking at all of their facets? Well, all of these things, because Tolkien, of course, left us many great treasures. Tolkien wrote, most of you are probably familiar with, well, this series, right, or set of books, or single great book, which, of course, I've pulled out one of the things. Perhaps you read The Hobbit when you were a child, like Stanley Unwin, who was asked to, or Rayner, now I can't remember which Unwin it is, the father, Per Unwin Per asked Unwin Fee to review it for him, and he said, well, The Hobbit would probably be good for, 9-year-olds, and he was 10. Then, of course, Tolkien was asked to write some more about hobbits, and we have, therefore, The Lord of the Rings. And if you, like I, were given this set as a child, I got mine when I was 11, you've grown up with these stories. They've become part of the thing that is your own word hoard, your own treasure trove. Perhaps you had, wondered about, oh my goodness, they're dusty. What a Númenórean tile is doing on the top of the box, when we don't really hear that much about Númenóreans except for in the appendix. Or Elwë, Luthien Tunuviol, Finwë, Luthien Tunuviol, Fingolfin, Feanor, Idril Celebrimbor, Arundel. Did you know who any of these characters were? Well, you wouldn't have if you were reading this book when I was reading it, because I got them around the time the set came out in 1973 or thereabouts. And of course, the Silmarillion hadn't yet been published. This is my original copy, therefore taped up because it fell apart. I didn't get the hardcover. I was too young to be getting hardcovers in those days. And there's that mysterious drawing, Tolkien's drawings. These are Tolkien's drawings. I didn't appreciate that when I first got the stories. I thought these were not nearly as exciting as, the Brothers Hildebrand, or I don't think Alan Lane. Why can't I remember any names today? Names. We need to know the names. We need to know who Arundel was. We need to know where this great treasure, this great trove of stories came from. Tolkien, of course, spent his entire life working on them, and sometimes was writing stories, other stories for children, like Roverandom, or stories for his own children growing up, the Father Christmas letters, with yet more wonderful drawings by Tolkien. We also have stories that he wrote that were more, shall we say, allegorical, like Leaf by Niggle, or wonderfully enough, Farmer Giles of Ham, which is, it's not really an allegory necessarily so much as an academic parody, this parody of what it's like to look for place names in stories about dragons and dragon tamers, as Farmer Giles was. He also wrote a story that maybe some of you are familiar with, which has given me the title for this series, The Smith of Wootton Major, because of all of his stories, Smith of Wootton Major and Leaf by Niggle are usually considered to be the ones that he was using to explain his own creative process. In Smith gets this magic Fey star at a great feast, this children's feast, where they have a magical fairy cake, and because of, we'll go into this story in more detail, but what happens to Smith is he gets this Fey star, claps it to his brow, becomes Starbrow, and then spends the rest of his adulthood getting to travel in fairy and take journeys there and have a variety of adventures that are almost adventures but not quite, and that's almost like what Tolkien felt he himself had done, found a way into fairy, whatever that means, and come back out with this ability to make sometimes practical things, like his lectures in Anglo-Saxon and his academic essays. I have some of those here too, published in Monsters and the Critics. Beowulf, Monsters and the Critics, is one of the great essays of the field, and Tolkien, through that essay, is largely credited with creating Beowulf studies as it is in its modern incarnation. Although, of course, his translation of Beowulf did not come out until after he died. His son Christopher, whom you all may be familiar with, was his great editor. Tolkien was sort of cathected, as Smith is in this story, about how much he had done that was practical and useful, and how much he had done simply making filigree and ornament, and he gives himself a sort of, here's Smith in his smithery, and what kinds of things Smith makes are, to a certain extent, this sort of tension that Tolkien himself was playing with. Am I a great artist, or am I a great philologist and scholar? Smith, in the story, when he gets the Fey star and becomes some way allied with fairy, became well known in his country, not only in his own village, but in many others round about, for his good workmanship. His father was a smith, and he followed him in his craft and bettered it. Smith's son, he was called, while his father was still alive, and then just Smith. For by that time he was the best smith between Far Easton and the Westwood, and he could make all kinds of things of iron in his smithy. Most of them, of course, were plain and useful, meant for daily needs. Farm tools, carpenter's tools, kitchen tools, and pots and pans, bars and bolts and hinges, pothooks, fire dogs, and horseshoes, and the like. They were strong and lasting, but they also had a grace about them, being shapely in their kinds, good to handle and to look at. But some things, when he had time, he made for delight. And they were beautiful, for he could work iron into wonderful forms that looked as light and delicate as a spray of leaves and blossom, but kept the stern strength of iron, or seemed even stronger. Few could pass by one of the gates or lattices that he made without stopping to admire it. No one could pass through it once it was shut. He sang when he was making things of this sort, and when Smith began to sing, those nearby stopped their own work and came to the smithy to listen. Tolkien loved singing. He wrote many songs into his stories. I'm sure, well, I always ask my students in my Tolkien course at Chicago this. When you read The Lord of the Rings, do you skip the songs or do you stop and hear them and play with the word sounds and play with the poetry? Tolkien, of course, also wrote great lengthy poems. He alludes to a few of them in The Lord of the Rings, particularly the great song of Beren and Luthien, which he called the Lay of Lithien, the release from bondage. When Aragorn sings a little piece of it to the hobbits, he says, this is a portion of a longer song, and I'm only going to tell you part of it. Tolkien had written it, and many say, well, that's what gives great depth to his stories. He's not just smithing with words in The Lord of the Rings, this one great story. He's smithing an entire world building, as we call it, and creating the pieces on the pieces of the stories that show up in odd places and things like these beautiful jewel-like ornaments of his characters' names. Tolkien was also a great translator. You can see what a wide variety of odd editions I have. Here's one of the Del Rey paperback editions of Tolkien's amazingly beautiful alliterative verse. His translations from the Middle English of Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Sir Orfeo. He was also a great editor. He did an edition of the Ancren and Vissa, the rule for anchoresses for the Early English Text Society. He was particularly interested in that text because he felt like it had the language that was his own family's, this Midlands, Middle English that he saw as being the ancestor of his own diction, his own love of wordsmithing. So Tolkien creates this wonderful word hoard, and we can think about how many of these stories, when you read them, do you wish you, like the hobbits, were a part of, and why? What is your response to wanting to be in these stories? Well, let's read on. I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. I wonder, said Frodo. But I don't know, and that's the way of a real tale. Take any one that you're fond of. You may know or guess what kind of tale it is, happy ending or sad ending, but the people in it don't know, and you don't want them to. No, sir, of course not. Beren now, he never thought he was going to get that Silmaril from the Iron Crown in Thangorodrim, and yet he did, and that was a worse place and a blacker danger than ours. But that's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief, and beyond it. And the Silmaril went on and came to Arundel. And why, sir, I never thought of that before. You've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales never end? No, they never end as tales, said Frodo, but the people in them come and go when their part's ended. Our part will end later, or sooner. Now, that's a great deal of the magic, I think, that when you're reading The Lord of the Rings and you think, how is it that I feel like this world exists out there? Because the characters keep talking about it. And Sam, in particular, keeps talking about how he wants to meet elves. He's like, oh, I'd love to meet elves. I want to go on this journey with you, Mr. Frodo, because that way I can meet elves and hear their stories. Sam is always the one wanting to hear the stories of the elves, and Sam is the one that has this recognition of the power, the importance of being inside the story. I mean, Frodo, by the time that they're having this conversation on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, is wrestling so much with the ring that it's hard for him to have any sense of being in control of his own body, much less being, part of this story. But Sam is able to look at it and say, well, the people in the tales at the time, they don't necessarily want those adventures. and yet somehow they were willing to go ahead, forge ahead, to notice, as Sam has suddenly done, that he's in the same story that Aragorn had told the hobbits at Weathertop about Beren and Luthien, and that they are in that same story, that there is in that star glass that Galadriel has given Frodo, the light of the star of the Silmaril, that Arundel, whom you might have only ever realized was on the box of your books, that light of the same star is there with them in the vial of Galadriel. So that there's some sense that even though, we get this little boxed story, this 3-volume single book that's also with that Hobbit story that somehow ramifies out into belonging in, well, the entire 12-volume History of Middle-earth that Christopher edited after his father died, because Tolkien had been making notes and drafts and sketches and hypotheses and previous stories and later stories his entire life, and that the Lord of the Rings is just this piece of this great story. So when you read it, you have that sense of, I'd like to be in that story too. Could I be a part of that story? Well, you can. I mean, there's a great deal of fan fiction when people are writing, taking Tolkien's invitation that he expressed in the letter to Milton Waldman about, I want people to take what I've said and write more into it. I've sketched these stories, and I would love for other minds and hands to add to them. But that desire to be in the story, is that something that makes you rejoice? Or is it something that makes you terrified? Well, let's read on a little bit more. They never end as tales, said Frodo, but our part will end. And then we can have some rest and some sleep, said Sam. He laughed grimly. And I mean just that, Mr. Frodo. I mean plain, ordinary rest and sleep and waking up to a morning's work in the garden. I'm afraid that's all I'm hoping for all the time. All the big important plans are not for my sort. Still, I wonder if we shall ever be put into songs or tales. We're in one, of course. But, I mean, put into words, told by the fireside, or read out of a great big book with red and black letters, years and years afterwards. And people will say, let's hear about Frodo and the Ring. And they'll say, yes, that's one of my favorite stories. Frodo was very brave, wasn't he, Dad? Yes, my boy, the famousest of the hobbits, and that's saying a lot. It's saying a lot too much, said Frodo, and he laughed. A long, clear laugh from the heart. Such a sound had not been heard in those places since Sauron came to Middle-earth. To Sam, suddenly, it seemed as if all the stones were listening, and the tall rocks leaning over them. But Frodo did not heed them. He laughed again. Why, Sam, he said, to hear you somehow makes me merry as if the story was already written. But you've left out one of the chief characters, Samwise the Stout-Hearted. I want to hear more about Sam, Dad. Why didn't they put more of his talk, Dad? That's what I like. It makes me laugh. And Frodo wouldn't have got far without Sam, would he, Dad? Now, Mr. Frodo, said Sam, you shouldn't make fun. I was serious. There are so many things going on in this passage, not just this desire to be in the story. And Sam, you say, I'd love to go on an adventure. I'd love to hear elves. I'd love to be an elf. How many of you want to be an elf? How many of you would rather be a hobbit? I always have students in my classes that want to write stories about orcs. But most of the time, people want to be hobbit or elves. Or men, Eowyn, Aroarim. Who do you want to be when you hear this story? What kind of character do you want to be taking on? Do you want to be immortal like the elves and be caught in the sorrow of watching things linger and fade? Or do you want to be mortal like the men and the hobbits and recognize, as Frodo was saying, that your time is limited and you're part of this great story, but your portion of it is only going to be a little bit? And how do you respond to the invitation to be in such a great story. Sam says, I want to go home and have a normal life with a garden, but I'm willing to be in this great adventure with you wherever it leads. But maybe I'd like to be in the story still, we're in one, but what if we end up in one that other people want to hear and tell, and that red and black letters, it's a very interesting little detail for Sam to say. It could be simply a medieval manuscript, but what kind of books have red and black letters that you read and reread and read over and over and over again in your life? Let's hear about Frodo and the Ring. Let's hear about that story again and again and again. You want to hear the story. You want to have it recur, maybe every year at a particular time of year, maybe almost liturgically. Frodo was very brave, yes, the bravest of the hobbits, the most famous, and then Frodo recognizes what Sam has done for him. He's given him this story that makes him laugh. And he laughed a long, clear laugh from his heart. What kind of stories give you that kind of joy? What kind of stories make you want to be inside them and risk everything and bring you to joy? Well, of course, there are theories. One of my favorite theories, this is another of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, is, well, you're in some kind of story. Well, we call them a fairy story, a fairy tale, a particular kind of tale. And if any of you know Pratchett and Witches Abroad, that's what the witches find themselves in. They found themselves in previous stories and Shakespearean plays. For example, like Midsummer Night's Dream and Lords and Ladies, when they have to deal with the elves, as Pratchett tells the stories. But here, they find themselves in a fairy story, and their response is not quite what Sam's had been, right? Because Pratchett has this idea that stories are something to be wary of. There's something possibly to be fought. Because stories are important. People think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around. Stories, this is Pratchett's theorizing about the problem of stories, right? Stories exist independently of their players. If you know that, the knowledge is power. Stories, great flapping ribbons of shaped space-time, have been blowing and uncoiling around the universe since the beginning of time, and they have evolved. The weakest have died, and the strongest have survived, and they've grown fat on the retelling. Stories twisting and blowing through the darkness. And their very existence overlays a faint but insistent pattern on the chaos that is history. Stories etch grooves deep enough for people to follow in the same way that water follows certain paths down a mountainside. And every time fresh actors tread the path of the story, the groove runs deeper. This is called the theory of narrative causality. And it means that a story, once started, takes a shape. It picks up all the vibrations of all the other workings of that story that has ever been. This is why history keeps on repeating all the time. So 1,000 heroes have stolen fire from the gods. 1,000 wolves have been eaten by grandmother. 1,000 princesses have been kissed. 1,000,000 unknowing actors have moved unknowing through the pathways of story. It is now impossible for the third and youngest son of any king, if he should embark on a quest which has so far claimed his older brothers, not to succeed. Stories don't care who takes part in them. All that matters is that the story gets told, that the story repeats. Or, if you prefer to think of it like this, stories are a parasitical life form, warping lives in the service only of the story itself. It takes a special kind of person to fight back and become the bicarbonate of history, once upon a time. Now, in Witches Abroad, of course, the Granny Weatherwax, spoiler alert, finds out that her sister, the good one, Granny Weatherwax has to be the good one because the sister is the bad one, although she's pretending to be the good fairy godmother by making people live within the stories. Now, this is two rather different claims about the significance of finding yourself in a story. Sam is delighted at the idea. He's saying, we're in the same tale. We're in that same story in which Beren and Luthien get the Silmaril from the Iron Crown and Thangorodrim. and it becomes the light of Arundel, and that light is in our story now, and we're in it, and maybe people will tell a story about us. And it's like that when, in Pratchett's version of things, finding yourself in the groove of the story is, for Sam, invigorating, meaningful, and for Frodo, joyous, saying, yes, you make me laugh to think this is significant, this is meaningful. Our lives are within a pattern, within a frame of reference that actually gives us purpose and joy. Whereas Pratchett, writing in his wonderful fairy tale satire, for him, the pleasure, the joy that the witches have is in being able to escape from the story, to make sure that the grandmother is not eaten by the wolf, in order to make sure that the princess does not marry the frog, and for people to make their own stories. We have here a tension of modernity. Do you find yourself rejoicing at the thought that you are within a great story, or do you find yourself wanting to break out of it? Well, Tolkien, got my giant pile and hoard of books here, and they were all in order when I started, and now I can't find the one that I want. Yes, here it is. Tolkien, of course, Del Rey has the oddest covers for their books, right? Tolkien, of course, theorized deeply about the significance of fairy stories, and over the course of the series, I'll be introducing you to a variety of his theorizings, but the greatest essay that he did was, of course, his on fairy stories, and he's talking about the particular characteristics that belong to what he called a fairy story, and he's trying to undo the damage that the late 19th century, early 20th century folklorists had done to fairy stories by making them all for children, and making all the fairies like Tinkerbell sized, and making all of the problems that the characters face somehow insubstantial. And Tolkien, is upset with people like Spencer and maybe Shakespeare. I'm not sure. Tolkien's relationship to Shakespeare is hard to suss out, right? But he was frustrated with the way in which they'd made fairy stories something that was presumed to be for children and therefore dismissible, as of course many modern critics have dismissed Tolkien's work, saying, well, it's all just about escapism, right? It's like you have that happy ending and that's just, well, running away. Well, of course, Tolkien would say, well, why, exactly why not, right? What is that happy ending? What is that escape that fairy stories are suggesting is possible? And in his variation, it's escape from death, right? You're trying to understand, is it the fear of dying, or is it the fear of dying without significance? Because of course what the hobbits are talking about is, we find ourselves in the story, we may or may not survive this, but there's a joy in thinking that will still be told, their adventure will still be told. Well, it's the story, the consolation of fairy stories has this consolation of the happy ending, right? But why is it such a happy ending? Why is it an ending that actually brings you to laughter, as Frodo is thinking? Well, it's because Tolkien coins this great word of the Eucatastrophe. The Eucatastrophic tale, he says, is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. How does it accomplish this? The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the Eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn. For there is no true end to any fairy tale. They don't end, right? It's like when Sam said, "Don't the great tales never end?" How are we in? Why are we in this continuing story? Why is it that there is both the once upon a time, but the happily ever after is like to be continued? This joy, which is one of the things fairy stories can produce extremely well, supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace. never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. The power in fairy stories, as Tolkien understood it, was this turn, right? This turn when everything has been hopeless, when all you can see, all Beren and Luthien could see as they were trapped in Morgoth's fortress, when Luthien had lost her guardian dog, her great companion, when Beren, in the long run is going to lose his hand because the wolf is going to bite it off and take the Silmaril away again, that this hopelessness is necessary to that moment when the characters recognize this glimpse of joy. There's a moment of grace. It's not easy to do, Tolkien says. Even modern stories can produce this effect sometimes, but it's not easy to do. It depends on the whole story, which is the setting of the turn, and yet reflects a glory backwards. Right? So there's this, you have to get to the point where the characters have gone, and you're not just putting them through suffering for the sake of, suffering. There has to be that moment of grace so that the joy comes with sorrow. The joy comes poignant as grief. And it's in such stories, it's in these fairy stories, which is very different from what Pratchett is playing off of, right? I don't think you have any sort of turns like this ever in Pratchett. There's no moment when you realize that the characters have only succeeded by grace, although maybe in Thud. Maybe I should do an episode just on Thud to talk about that, because there's almost a moment there. But most of the time, in Pratchett stories, they get out by cleverness or wit, right? That there's some stratagem that is applied, and for example, Granny Weatherwicks outwits her sister with knowing how to get herself out of the mirrors. Maybe I can do one on that too. There's the mirrors of the stories I keep ramifying, right? I see one mirror, one story, and it reflects, and I think of 18 others. That is, of course, what both Pratchett and Tolkien are playing with, but the sense that Tolkien has of us, how finding yourself in the story can then give you this turn of joy. When in such stories, when the sudden turn comes, this Eucatastrophe, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire that for a moment passes outside of the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. And then he's quoting here from the Black Bull of Norway. 7 long years I served for thee, the glassy hill I clamb for thee, the bloody shirt I wrang for thee, and wilt not thou waken and turn to me? He heard and turned to her. When Tolkien talks about this, he says that there's that piercing of the web of the frame that you have been set within this story that you don't want to get out of, but the joy comes only when you feel that sense that it has broken through into reality. It has taken you from this world, this Middle Earth, outside of its own boundaries, and caught a glimpse of heaven. Now, what kind of stories create that sort of effect? I'm going to propose to you in this series, and want to convince you by way of reading the stories, pay very, very careful attention to the language that Tolkien uses, pay very careful attention to the resonances that he has in his stories, paying attention to the way in which he creates his own web of stories that is always in conversation with other stories without actually just taking them as sources, to convince you that there is a kind of story that is ultimate for Tolkien, and that it's the one we're in now. Here's a glimpse. This is another of my very favorite authors, Anthony Easelin, in his Ironies of Faith. Hint, hint, the laughter at the heart of Christian literature. This is the kind of story that we're in. Frodo laughs. What kind of story makes you laugh? What kind of story is a comedy? A divine comedy. It makes you cry too. The miracle, I'm quoting Tony Easelin now, the miracle is that God should have created us in the first place. And having created us, should allow us, mere dust, to petition him for a bliss which we cannot merit, but which he wishes above all to give us. The miracle is that God made beings whose lives have eternal meaning, being capable of love. Now, Easelin is a reader of Tolkien. He has a lovely essay in this volume on Leaf by Niggle, which I will probably also point you to when we read that one. But all of the words in these two sentences are so important, that there's the miracle of creation, that God creates us out of love, that he creates us from dust for bliss. Remember, one of Tolkien's children's stories is Mr. Bliss, right? And it's about a guy who drives around in his car. I can't get my copy. It's trapped in my office on campus. It's this odd little story about Mr. Bliss, right? Why do we worry about Mr. Bliss? Why do we worry about Frodo laughing? Because we are made out of dust for joy. And capable of love. This is the story that Tolkien invites us into over and over and over again in his wordsmithing, in his crafting, in his recognition that we are made in the image and likeness of a maker, a great smith, if you will, who made things practical for us, things to be used, and things to delight in and to enjoy. And that we, being given this ability, make still in the image in which we were made, fallen though we are, dust though we are, insignificant as we are, we make things. We make beautiful and practical things. But the greatest thing we make is song in praise of our Creator. Now that is the fairy story that, as far as Tolkien was concerned, he was trying to tap into and carry with him. And curiously enough, of course, he only puts it in an epilogue too on fairy stories. And he's saying this joy, which I have selected as the mark of the true fairy story or romance, needs a little more thinking about. And he's just thinking, okay, so maybe every subcreation, that's a very important phrase. And he subcreates with this idea, making within the pattern. Pratchett doesn't consider his creativity as making within the pattern. He likes understanding gods as things that you make out of your imagination, and if you have belief in them, well, they come to be existing. No, Tolkien understands us to be making within that pattern as sub-creators. We follow the pattern that is given to us on the mountain as the pattern of the tabernacle is given to Moses. There's always these layers of references, and I'm going to find another one in that passage that I read to you about the hobbits on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. I'm wondering whether you're thinking about it now already, because it's scriptural and the patterns are there, right? But the great pattern, always the greatest pattern, is that of the gospel, the evangelium. And it only comes by grace that we have that experience of story. I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect, as to others of their strange nature. This strange nature being made out of dust, capable of love. That's Easelin, right? But we are making creatures. We're making creatures. We're smiths, above all. Wordsmiths, ironsmiths, smiths that create things that dragons went to hoard. Why do dragons want to hoard them? Well, think about that, right? We're making things. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, purely artistic, beautiful and moving, mythical, in their near-perfect, self-contained significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable Eucatastrophe. That Tolkien talks about things as mythical. I will talk with you about the problem of mythology and what it's done to Christianity, and why we should embrace the fact that there's stories that we live by, the myths that we live by. Particularly Protestants following Rudolf Bultmann have been very anxious about this. Catholics, we need to, if you're Catholic and listening to it, own the myth, own the making, own the mythology and the story and the joy and the artistry and the song and the liturgy, and we'll get everybody else there to be singing with us. Myth. But the Gospels, they're a different kind of fairy story. This story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the Eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inconsistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. Isn't that a story that you would love to find yourselves in? Would you not love to find yourselves within the story of creation, finding yourselves to be making creatures made in the image and likeness of a maker, redeemed out of love? And would not that make you laugh? Indeed, would not that make the very rocks and stones to sing? And notice what Tolkien did in that passage. That we started this passage with Frodo feeling the stones hateful. I don't like anything here at all. Step or stone, breath or bone, earth, air, and water all seem accursed. But so our path is laid. You are treading through the rocks and the difficulty, and all you can feel is death and burdensome. And then here's Sam, who says, I wonder what kind of story we're in. We're in an adventure. We're in the same story still. We're in the story when the light came from heaven and gave us joy. And maybe people will tell our story. Maybe we will be in that story as well. We're in one. Maybe they'll read to us. Maybe they'll read about it from books with red and black lettering. Well, there is a theory that what Tolkien's talking about here is a book of Arthurian stories that was published around the time that he was working on the Lord of the Rings, and it had red and black lettering. But medieval books are mainly liturgical books. If you have a book from the Middle Ages, it's most likely a liturgical book because that's what they made most of. And red is to mark feast days, right? So you'll have a feast day reading an excerpt from the Old Testament, the epistles, or the letters of the New Testament. We have Tolkien's letters too. We'll be dealing with epistles a lot. Here's the other form of our scripture, right? Tolkien's letters. And then you'll have the gospel. You'll have a gospel reading that you are meant, as a Christian listening to the story, to find yourself within. But there's another kind of reading that's there always in the midst of the liturgical readings that it's kind of easy to forget. Sometimes they're sung, sometimes they're chanted, but they're the core of Christian worship. And there's an echo in what Frodo says here. Saying a lot too much, said Frodo, and he laughed. A long, clear laugh from his heart. Such a sound had not been heard in those places since Sauron came to Middle-earth. When Sauron is there, there is no joy, there is no laughter, there is no singing. To Sam, suddenly, it seemed as if all the stones were listening, and the tall rocks leaning over them. But Frodo did not heed them. He laughed again. The very rocks and stones will sing. I probably remember that not from the Psalms, but from Jesus Christ Superstar, Hosanna, right? But that is the kind of resonance that Tolkien is always playing with, that you should be singing as you are finding yourself within this story. And it just occurs to me, and this is also the kind of thing that I hope happens while I'm talking to you, the singing of the smithery, that it's with the beginning of smithing, as described in the Old Testament, that you have this kind of beating of the hammers, the beating of the song. We're going to get the beat. I'm also engaged in a project this summer of learning to write poetry. If you join me in Telegram and my Dragon Common Room with Learn Iambic Pentameter right now, you get the beat. You get the words smithed in rhythm, so that the trivium and the quadrivium are married in the great song of poetry, this great song of the liturgy. The arts and the sciences come together in this great making of creation. I hope I've said enough to entice you to want to enter into this story with me and to share with me the making of beauty and the smithing of words and the crafting of joy, and to understand why that turn comes with the poignancy that it does, so that we pass outside of the frame of the story that we think we're in, into the reality of the story for which we were made. Till next time, thanks for joining me. The road goes ever on.